humanoid corporeal, part-time college professor, full-time loser. And what a awful, weird, bad, distressing day to be a human being on the earth. Because when the United States becomes an autocracy, unfortunately, it's everyone's problem. From one day to the next, with the release of one document, the United States system of government has been changed. We go from one system of government to the next. And one of the most bloodless and rapid coups ever effected in the history of all politics. The irony being that the coup is only possible based on the contradictions and the rules of the very system that was just undermined. It is the Constitution that gives an audacious and fascistic court the opportunity to make terrible decisions like the one they have just made. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, if you haven't been following the news, which I don't blame you, it's pretty taxing. We all deserve breaks from it. But the Supreme Court ruled today on presidential immunity. Now, the reason for this ruling is ultimately sort of fairly small compared to the gravity of the ruling itself. It's not small, but compared to the gravity of the ruling, it's small. The issue that's ostensibly this is about, that draws this decision the Supreme Court has made today, is whether Donald J. Trump can be tried for crimes he committed both while in office and out of office. Brief summary is that presidents are immune from criminal prosecution. Presidents can violate the law if they do so in a way that is connected to official activity. And that is written so vaguely as to sort of seem to mean that the president can say, I don't like you, I would like to officially kill you as the president. And if they do that, they can kill you. Not only that, but presidents are immune once they leave office if the crimes they commit after leaving office can be linked to things they did officially in office. And so, again, in the narrow, small view, what this does is give Trump immunity from organizing a coup. And if you've seen any of the January 6th Commission material, it wasn't an accidental insurrection. They had so much evidence. Their goal was to create a riot that would make it impossible to certify Biden's election, which would then kick the election to the Republican-controlled Congress, and Trump could be appointed president by Congress, despite the election results. That's what they were going for. But Trump would also be immune for his stealing of nuclear secrets and his refusal to give them up for months up until the point where his home got raided. And anything else he's done with those documents. This is going to be obviously big news, and there's going to be lots of really convenient little summaries. I thought something we could do that's a little bit different and a little bit nerdier is we could actually read the decision together. Because I think there's going to be so much misinformation, whether it's understandable out of pure panic, whether it's copium because people don't want to imagine how bad this really is. It's hard to overstate how bad this is. You think about soft power just a little bit, and I want to make space to talk about soft power in a more dedicated way later in the stream. But think about what it means for every other political actor to live in a system where they understand that the president can do anything they want to them at any time. Autocrats don't need to round everybody up and put a gun to everyone's head. They just need people to understand that that's possible. And it changes behavior. It creates cascading effects and behavioral changes. And we now live in a system where every member of that system has to really feel the possibility of executive action. Who were the people that voted for this? The 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. Now that we live in an autocracy and not a republic, or some kind of autocratic republic hybrid that's mostly autocratic, were Biden to just kill all 6 of those justices and to threaten the Senate to vote for 6 new ones, it would be legal. If Congress wanted to impeach the president could kill the people trying to impeach them or fire them or do anything else he wanted till the impeachment went away. That's why a president will not be held accountable when a president has these types of powers. Simply no one will go there, or not enough people will go there to be a real threat. But technically, Biden is now an autocrat, and the Supreme Court did that. Pretty arrogant, because they seem to think that the autocrat they're going to get is the one they want, which is Trump. And they've forgotten that they've just made the current guy an autocrat. All right. Excited? I'm not. Federal grand jury indicted former President Donald J. Trump on 4 counts for conduct that occurred during his presidency following the November 2020 election. The indictment alleged that after losing that election, Trump conspired to overturn it by spreading knowingly false claims of election fraud to obstruct the collecting, counting, and certifying of the election results. Trump moved to dismiss the indictment based on presidential immunity, arguing that a president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecutions for actions performed within the outer perimeter of his official responsibilities, and that the indictment's allegations fell within the core of his official duties. The district court denied Trump's motion to dismiss, holding that former presidents do not possess federal criminal immunity for any acts. The D.C. court affirmed. Both the district and the D.C. circuit declined to decide whether the indicted conduct involved official acts. Under our constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of the presidential power entitles a former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecutions for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. As he is entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts, there is no immunity for unofficial acts. I want to draw attention to the language of authority, to absolute immunity for criminal prosecutions for actions with his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. The use of authority rather than responsibilities or duties is really critical. This makes it very broad. For example, the president has the duty to defer to the will of Congress when considering certain types of military force. The president has an authority over certain types of military force. So Congress can regulate, for example, how the president would use SEAL Team 6. That would be a duty or a responsibility. But the president has the authority to use them, which means the president is immune anytime he is using his authority to give orders to SEAL Team 6. In other words, it means he can do whatever he wants with them. This case is the first criminal prosecution in our nation's history of a former president for actions taken during his presidency. Determining whether and under what circumstances such a prosecution may proceed requires careful assessment of the scope of presidential power under the Constitution. The nature of that power requires that a former president have some immunity from criminal prosecution for acts during his tenure in office, at least with respect to the president's exercise of his core constitutional powers. This immunity must be absolute. As for his remaining official actions, he is entitled to at least presumptive immunity. Article 2 of the Constitution vests executive power in a president of the United States of America. The president has duties of unrivaled gravity and breadth. His authority to act necessarily stems either from an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself. In the latter case, the president's authority is sometimes conclusive and preclusive. When the president exercises such authority, Congress cannot act on and courts cannot examine the president's actions. It follows that an act of Congress, either a specific one targeted at the president or a generally applicable one, may not criminalize the president's actions within his exclusive constitutional power. Neither may the courts adjudicate a criminal prosecution that examines such presidential actions. The court thus concludes that the president is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution for conduct within his exclusive sphere of constitutional authority. Not all of the president's acts fall within his conclusive and preclusive authority. The reasons that justify the president's absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for acts within the scope of his exclusive constitutional authority do not extend to conduct in areas where his authority is shared with Congress. To determine the president's immunity in this context, the court looks primarily to the framers' design of the presidency within the separation of powers, precedent on presidential immunity in the civil context, and criminal cases where a president resisted prosecutorial demands for documents. The framers designed the presidency to provide for a vigorous and energetic executive. Federalist number 7. They vested the president with supervisory and policy responsibilities of utmost discretion and sensitivity. Nixon versus Fitzgerald. Appreciating the unique risks that arise when the president's energies are diverted by proceedings that might render him unduly cautious in the discharge of his official duties. The court has recognized presidential immunities and privileges rooted in the constitutional tradition of the separation of powers and supported by our history. In Fitzgerald, for instance, the court concluded that a former president is entitled to absolute immunity from damages liability for acts within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. Now, I want to be clear, what's talking about here is like, say, the president used military force or something, or the president made a decision, and maybe it caused a lot of property damage to some citizen or a corporation. And so after the president leaves office, the president, the corporation or the citizen tries to sue the president or bring charges against the president. There's a sleight of hand here where some of the prior case law is more dealing not with the question of whether presidents can do whatever they want, but they're dealing with the question of where does liability sit. The president historically has some ability to act within the office of the president without being personally liable, criminally or civil. Instead, the government is liable. The court's dominant concern was to avoid diversion of the president's attention during the decision-making process caused by needless worry as to the possibility of damages actions stemming from any particular official decision. By contrast, when prosecutors have sought evidence from the president, the court has consistently rejected presidential claims of absolute immunity. During the treason trial of former Vice President Aaron Burr, for instance, Chief Justice Marshall rejected President Thomas Jefferson's claim that the president could not be subjected to a subpoena. Marshall simultaneously recognized, however, the existence of a privilege to withhold certain official papers. And when subpoena issued to President Richard Nixon, the court rejected his claim of absolute privilege. But recognizing the public interest in candid, objective, and even blunt or harsh opinions in presidential decision-making, it held that a presumptive privilege protects presidential communications, because that privilege relates to the effective discharge of a president's powers. And the court deemed it fundamental to the operation of government and inextricably rooted in the separation of powers under the Constitution. Criminally prosecuting a president for official conduct undoubtedly poses a far greater threat of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch than simply seeking evidence in his possession. The danger is greater than what led the court to recognize absolute presidential immunity from civil damages liability. The president would be chilled from taking the bold and unhesitating action required of an independent executive. Although the president might be exposed to fewer criminal prosecutions than civil damage suits, the threat of trial, judgment, and imprisonment is a far greater deterrent and plainly more likely to distort presidential decision-making than the potential payment of civil damages. I want to stop here because this is extraordinarily perverse. This is where you can really see a divergence into authoritarian thinking. So what the court is saying here is, look, it's already the case that if the president does something that if another citizen did, someone might be able to sue them in civil court for money for damages. There's already legal precedent that says the president's not personally liable for that. So you sue the government or whatever instead. This past precedent says if In executing the powers of the office, the president has to constantly worry about the threat of lawsuit. Then it could hinder the efficient functioning of the government. And one thing we have to understand about that is whether we like that or not, there's at least a reasonable argument for that from the perspective of if you support having a president at all, which I want to just clarify. As an anarchist, I don't even think we should have this office, but we do. So I want to understand how it's working. So the reason why the president would be immune personally from civil damages is, to make it simple, anyone can sue anything over anything. You have the right to accuse someone of a perceived violation against you and to bring that to court. And it is at court where a judge will dismiss you out of hand or tell you you have a case. But there's no real limitation on the ability for someone to bring a suit and clog up the court system. And if the president is personally liable in civil cases, then the president has to account for what it's going to mean. So from the perspective of having a president and having a civil legal system, it makes sense that the president's personal liability would be shifted to sort of a federal liability of the government. So the Supreme Court says, look, the president has to have immunity from little things like civil cases. Then surely that must mean the president must have immunity from very serious charges, violations of criminal law. So the first issue with that is violations of criminal law go through a completely different process. It is elements of the state that oversee, examine, and bring criminal charges. It's not any like yokel out there with any delusion about what they're entitled to. Which is why this sentence here acknowledges that for any president, criminal liability would be much more rare. Although the president might be exposed to fewer criminal prosecutions than civil damages, the threat of trial, judgment, and imprisonment is a far greater deterrent and plainly more likely to distort presidential decision-making than potential payment of civil damages. And this is the next point. The reason for the distinction between civil violations and criminal violations is because criminal violations are more severe. They're seen as violations of a deeper and more important social contract. And there's a reason in the logic of a criminal justice system, if you're going to have one, why you would have cascading punishments and consequences depending on the type of crime you commit. From this perspective, it would be more important. They've sort of inverted the logic. They say, well, if the president is immune from civil cases, because that might make the president worry about all these consequences, well, then surely they must not have to worry about the consequences of doing very serious crimes either. Instead of having to worry about somebody suing them for $2,000, they shouldn't also have to worry about actually killing someone or whether something's a crime. And we have to understand that the role of the president is the chief executive. And the chief executive enforces the law in simple terms. And what they're arguing is that the chief law enforcement official of the country, the president of the United States, shouldn't have to worry about breaking the law. This sentence right here already gets to the heart of the matter. In order to enforce the law, they are saying the president must be above the law. If the president has to worry about what will happen if they do something illegal, then a president might not do illegal things. And if a president can't do illegal things, then a president is not going to be a good president. The perversion and corruption of the concept of the office is multifaceted. Instead of thinking the president should be held to a higher standard, it's that the president must be held to a lower standard. It's instead of thinking that the president needs to be attentive to the law in order to force it, the president must be inattentive to the law in order to enforce it. And they're very specifically saying here, the hesitation to execute the duties of his office fearlessly and fairly that might result when a president is making decisions under a pall of prosecution raises unique risks to the effective functioning of government. Very specifically and in the most direct language, the court decision is saying that the stakes of the issue are that without immunity, the president might be scared of consequences. And we see that here with this word fearlessly. They don't want the president to hesitate. They want the president to be able to act without fear of consequences. Their specific goal is to free the president from even having to think about consequences of anything they do. The president should exist as the sole individual who is above all consequences. Presidents have already been doing illegal things with a better conception of the office. This is going to base it irreparably. King above the law installed. It's appalling. As an anarchist, it's not hard to believe that we've gotten here. But if there are any other anarchists watching, I know many of us think this is the way it always is. What's the difference? This is a big difference. Because while there's been corruption and abuse of power is fairly common, there is a distinction between living in a corrupt hegemonic republic where the elites have to sort of hide and cover up their crimes, and living in an autocracy where soft and hard power make it clear from the outset that the elites can do whatever they want with total impunity. And if a president can do whatever he wants, that means anyone else the president likes can do whatever they want too. Because guess what power the president has? The president has this little thing called the ability to pardon people. The president can encloak and enshrine anyone else's behavior by tying it to an official act from the outset so that he doesn't even have to grant immunity later. And Donald Trump has also promoted the idea of a preemptive immunity. The president can give people get out of jail free cards. Essentially, the president can decree and give to someone a piece of paper that says they will be immune from future prosecutions around whatever it is they might do. Donald Trump has already been on record saying that not only should he be immune from anything he wants, but he should be able to give that power to anyone else he chooses as well. Is what I'm feeling. I'm not shocked. We have been going in this direction for a long time, and this court has been signaling an acceleration towards fascism. It's acted in lockstep with the broader fascist movement, largely over the last couple of years. And Trump has been very clear. I know a lot of people tuned Trump out these last few years. I don't blame you. We had 4 years of having to listen to this guy fucking ramble and whine. And once he got out of there, it was like finally like being released from a kind of torment. But in Trump's Truth Social and in his rallies and everything he's been doing, he's been very explicit. He's written about suspending the Constitution. He's promised that within the first week of his presidency, he will gut the federal bureaucracies, which is one of the most important checks on presidential powers, because the bureaucrats have their own authority, so they have the ability to say no to unlawful orders. He's promised to purge tens of thousands of those professionals and replace them with loyalists who, when Trump tells them to do something illegal, they will simply carry it out. He's been super explicit. And one of the things he's been explicit about is that not only should he have total immunity from everything, but he should be able to grant that power to anyone else he chooses as well. And even without Trump doing that, even if you didn't come up with this get out of jail free card scheme that Trump has proposed, essentially it would still exist because the president can still retroactively pardon anyone, or the president can operate in coordination with anyone they like and just sort of say, yeah, you know, my buddy over here who's going to dump a bunch of things into the river, I officially say that they have the right to dump all that mercury into the river. It's official. So let's move on. Taking into account these competing considerations, the court concludes that the separation of powers principles explicated in the court's precedent necessitate at least a presumptive immunity from criminal prosecution for a president's acts within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. Such an immunity is required to safeguard the independent and effective functioning of the executive branch and to enable the president to carry out his constitutional duties without undue caution. You wouldn't want the president having to worry about whether something is illegal. After all, it's only their job to enforce the law. Is the fucking logic here. I don't want to make it seem like it's like irrational or something, because it's not. This isn't like a stupid ruling. Why don't they get it? This is a political ruling. This is a court who has looked at the existing system of government and has decided that they don't like it. They favor an autocracy. They have been acting in coordination with an emerging fascist movement. And they have just passed a ruling that will essentially preemptively restructure the executive as a dictator so that if their fascist candidate wins, he can simply start on day one with complete immunity and absolute authority to do anything he wants with the president's unique control of the use of violence. If you simply listed the powers, the other branches of government appear to have more power and more significant power. Congress declares war. Congress makes treaties or approves treaties with foreign nations. Congress controls all federal spending. Congress controls all taxation. The Supreme Court interprets and is the final arbiter on all disagreements about what is happening with the law. They interpret the law. And the president, in a simple sense, again, enforces the law. However, the president is the sole branch of government that has the authority over the use of force. The president controls the policing apparatus. While Congress declares war, the president can still deploy and order the military around in a number of ways short of an official declaration of war and short of an act of Congress. And the ability for the president to use those things has already expanded. And by the way, because of this ruling, the president were to say, give an illegal order to a soldier to kill somebody, like say the Speaker of the House, and the soldier carried out that order, then it would end there because the president cannot be held liable for criminal activity. And so this is one of the biggest tells about the level of corruption of this ruling, because throughout this ruling, it keeps using this term official, the official authority of the president, the official authority of the president. Well, if the president is using their official authority, then it's not illegal. It only becomes a crime if they're not using their official authority. But this ruling says that they can't be held liable for their criminal activity if it seems connected to their official authority, which would seem to mean in practice that all the president would have to do is say, well, I thought it was part of my official authority. Because when we look at this ruling, which will set the precedent, what it specifically says is they don't want to have the president second guessing whether their activity is illegal or not. They want the president to be able to act without hesitation and fear. Essentially, this ruling makes those words part of the law. Back up here, where I highlighted hesitation and fear right here, this is part of the law now. This line right here is part of how another court would interpret whether the president did anything wrong. And they would have to measure whether a president trying to figure out whether they're allowed to do something or not constitutes hesitation and fear. And this ruling specifically says a president should not have to do that. A president should not have to worry about whether something's legal or not, which means that when a president acts outside of their official authority, they will still be immune. Even though this ruling tries to make it seem like you're only immune when it comes to your official authority. A president would just have to say, well, you know, I didn't have the time to look into whether that was part of my official authorities or not. I was trying to act without fear and hesitation because I'm the president. If you're going to have a legal system and a criminal justice system and the rest of us have to feel fear of consequence, perhaps the most powerful person on earth should also have to fear consequences for how they behave. At a minimum, the president must be immune from prosecution for an official act unless the government can show that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. But since the authority and functions of the executive branch, as defined here, include being able to act without hesitation and fear, any charge whatsoever would presumably limit the president's defined role as this ruling has established it. In other words, while we have this sentence here that makes it seem like there is a way to charge a president, in fact, there's not. It says, as long as they can show that it doesn't pose any danger to presidential authority, then you could hypothetically charge a president with a criminal act. But they have included as part of the concept of presidential authority the idea that any given president might hesitate and feel fear about the consequences of potentially illegal activity. And the moment that a president has to do that, you have violated the president's authority. That is specifically what this ruling says the president should be free from, is even having to worry about whether something is illegal. As for a president's unofficial acts, there is no immunity. Although presidential immunity is required for official actions to ensure that the president's decision-making is not distorted by the threat of future litigation stemming from those actions, that concern does not support immunity for unofficial conduct. The separation of powers does not bar prosecution predicated on the president's unofficial acts. But since they've defined official in a way that allows the president not to have to worry about whether they are operating outside of their official authority, it will be very easy for a president to simply state that what they thought they were doing was official. And that will settle it. Because they have literally made, by strong implication, the president's perception part of the test. And you have to understand this would not be a wonky sort of thing where the president's in front of a courtroom and they're arguing about the details of a president's mind. This is defined so broadly that any judge would dismiss a charge against a president out of hand because it would be clear how impossible it would be for a prosecution to weave a case that couldn't be tanked by the president simply saying, well, I thought it was legal. As this is written, that is what a president has to do to get away with anything they want. And therefore, no court would accept a case that is simply going to be over the second the president says those things. So I think a lot of people read this stuff and they think about it in a very legalistic way and not a political way. It's understandable. It's a legal document. So they think about having these complicated arguments, but when you put this together and apply it in the legal system, what it amounts to is a big wet fart. That's what any attempt to prosecute a president would be with these standards. It is so broad and so forgiving of a president that while you could imagine some hypothetical case there maybe a president could be held accountable, it could only exist in the abstract, because the president simply has to say, I thought it was official. I don't want to worry about whether it was official or not. I was trying to act. And since everyone would know that from the outset, why even bother trying to bring charges against the president? And why would you bring charges against the president when the president can just kill you if he wants to, by the way? President doesn't have to go around killing everyone. People simply have to know that the president can do that. The first step in deciding whether a former president is entitled to immunity from a particular prosecution is to distinguish his official from unofficial acts. In this case, no court thus far has drawn that distinction, in general or with respect to the conduct alleged in particular. It is therefore incumbent upon the court to be mindful that it is a court of final review and not first review. Critical threshold issues in this case are how to differentiate between the president's official and unofficial actions, and how to do so with respect to the indictment's extensive and detailed allegations covering a broad range of conduct. The court offers guidance on those issues. When the president acts pursuant to the constitutional statutory authority, he takes official action to perform the functions of his office. Determining whether an action is covered by immunity thus begins with assessing the president's authority to take that action. But the breadth of the president's discretionary responsibilities under the Constitution and laws of the United States frequently make it difficult to determine which of his innumerable functions encompassed a particular action. The immunity of the court, as recognized, therefore extends to the outer perimeter of the president's official responsibilities, covering actions so long as they are not manifestably or palpably beyond his authority. But since the president has the authority to use the apparatus of violence in general, there are limitations. The president actually right now cannot just kill American citizens or political opponents. But the president does have the authority to give orders that could result in the deaths of people. The president controls law enforcement essentially at the federal level. And when you combine that with a standard that is so forgiving that it specifically says the goal of immunity is to prevent the president from having to worry about whether his actions are beyond the scope of the law, then none of this matters. This is all bullshit designed to confuse you. This is the Supreme Court saying you're stupid. Nothing else they write after the purpose of immunity is to prevent the president from having to worry about whether their actions are illegal matters. Those words are part of how every court below the Supreme Court now, forever, is supposed to interpret the question of presidential immunity. The primary concern being that the president be freed from worrying about whether what they're doing is illegal or not. This is all horseshit. This is just putting crap in to make the document seem credible by adding jargon. Like, everything here makes logical sense, to be clear. It makes sense. As a paragraph, its logic is clear. The problem is that none of what this paragraph says matters at all in practice when this can be overruled by the primary concern that the president actually shouldn't be worried about whether what they're doing is illegal or not. They should simply be able to act regardless of the legality. In dividing official from unofficial conduct, courts may not inquire into the president's motives. So let's say that you had a president who controlled a real estate company, and there was a competing real estate company, and they were competing for prime real estate on one of the coasts, let's just say Malibu. And the president locked up all the executives of that competing real estate company. A prosecutor would not be allowed to question whether the president was motivated by their own self-interest. In dividing official from unofficial conduct, courts may not inquire into the president's motives. They've already said the first step in a potential prosecution is to determine what's official and what's not official. Well, you can't think about motivation at all when you do that. That would be highly intrusive. it would risk exposing even the most obvious instances of official conduct to judicial examination on the mere allegation of improper purpose. Nor may courts deem an action unofficial merely because it allegedly violates a generally applicable law. These are the little twists of language that signify the coup. The use of the word allegedly here is insane. I don't mean it's irrational. It's very rational from the perspective of a fascist that's trying to undermine rule of law and impose rule of man, rule of the individual, rule of the dictator. Because the point of a court is to rule on the truth of an allegation. Nor may courts deem an action unofficial. The purpose of the court is to make judgments about allegations. And what they have just said is that courts cannot do that. Courts cannot take allegations about whether an action is official or not and make a judgment one way or the other. Remember how I said all this stuff up here about how, well, a president could be prosecuted for an unofficial action was bullshit because in practice it wouldn't matter? Well, here's another reason here. This ruling disallows courts from making a determination about allegations around whether an act was official or not. So a president hypothetically could be held accountable for an unofficial act, except that a court cannot, according to this ruling, distinguish between the two. Leftists don't believe in the law, though, I thought. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is an issue outside the interest of the left, who disregard the Constitution, living document, and assert that all law enforcement is bad. With all due respect, maybe sit this one out, just a thought. Well, first of all, if you're a leftist that's interested in getting out of this system that we're in, then you have to understand this system. And if you're a human being that just lives in this system, then you probably have an interest in understanding the system. And if you're a leftist that's interested in moving towards a society that doesn't require the violent, coercive threat of consequence from the monopoly of violence of the state, because people are capable of self-governance, cooperation, and obeying the laws they make for themselves, then surely in the path from here to there, one of the things we must do is we must learn how to analyze power, analyze violence, and understand how systems work. Which means that leftists should be the last people sitting these things out. We have to understand how this system works in order to dismantle it. And if we want to build different systems, then we should be learning about how other systems work. And at least one of the things we can do with this is we can examine how an autocracy works. And either I'm right, and the more we do that, the more capable we become of self-governance and not needing rulers and representatives, and the closer we can get to a direct democracy that doesn't require coercion. Or I'm wrong, and centrists like you get to live in a world where at least more people, including the left, are banded together because we can at least agree that fascism and autocracy are wrong. Because honestly, most political traditions that have existed in the US, left and right, should be historically pretty hostile to what's happening. I know there's a distinction between the philosophy that exists in the abstract and the actual people that carry it and say they're part of it. But in abstract, libertarians should be appalled by this. Communists should be appalled by this. Traditional conservatives should be appalled by this. Centrists, liberals, progressives, anarchists, socialists should be appalled by this. Utopians like me can still dream and see how far we can take that. People like me can believe that Athenian direct democracy could have worked if done differently. And either it's possible to build that out, or we can't take people that far. As a political theorist, I think you can take it that far. But either people will be able to do it or they won't. There's an old slogan that the IWW used, building the new society within the shell of the old. You start by reconfiguring basic relationships of survival at the micro level in a way that encourages and rewards cooperation, democracy, deliberation, negotiation, compassion. And in building out, you can more properly test and grow whatever the human capacity is for actual self-government. That type of praxis doesn't run the same risk of collapsing into a dictatorship or collapsing into mob rule. You sort of have, even in a worst case scenario, a increased capacity within the existing system for something better. There's a way in which even the need for the court to do things like this, like the existence of this, operates as a kind of confession that another world is possible. I'm going to skip down to the dissenting opinion because I feel like they've established the ruling, and those terms are: the president should not feel fear. The president should be able to act without hesitation and specifically have such extraordinarily high degree of immunity that they literally should not have to worry about the consequences of their actions. So all the rest of the shit they say about official and unofficial acts is pure horse shit. It doesn't matter once you've said that. That should, like I said, that should really trouble anyone from any political ideology. Unless, again, you're a fascist, right? Keep in mind, too, armed with opinions, the 20th century saw a lot of horror and it saw a lot of human achievement. It saw a lot of degradation, whether it's climate, World War II, the violent death knells of the global empires, and then all the projects where the third world threw off hundreds of years of shackles, the space race, and the winning of World War II. I think, as a dreamer, it's important to keep in mind and kind of keep close to one's mind and one's heart that in the 1930s and 40s, most of the world, despite incredible differences, and particularly communism and capitalism, the communist states and the capitalist states, were able to agree on one thing, and that is that fascism had to go. And they won that struggle against fascism at great cost. Clearly, it's not fully won. It's not over. But that victory obviously mattered. It mattered that the fascists didn't win in the 40s, right? And I think it mattered that a massive spectrum of different interests and different ideologies were able to recognize that whatever their differences were, this sort of thing was worse. Well, keep in mind that Biden's not a leftist in any credible sense. We live in a polarized political situation. And so Biden wants to perform in a way that makes it possible for the broadest spectrum of people can imagine themselves at least gritting their teeth and stepping into a ballot box and saying, well, at least he's better than the other guy. In truth, Biden's done some things for unions that have been better than like the last 3 decades of presidents, but he's still essentially a part of the New Democrat, Reaganite, neoliberal alliance. That wing of the Democratic Party figured out how to perform as if they were kind of New Deal progressives, right? The traditional center left of the Democratic Party were the FDR New Dealers. They learned how to kind of talk that talk while literally dismantling New Deal policies. And for all of Biden's life, Biden has been one of the conservative Democrat crusaders against the New Deal. That's a huge part of his legislative legacy. So if you're a leftist, you just either hate Biden or you grit your teeth and vote for him anyways. Like Clinton, he can go out there and talk to some group of people that are marginalized or act like he really cares about kind of social justice issues by giving a speech. And, you know, for a lot of people, that's enough. I think there's some truth to what you're saying. I'm not telling you anything new. Obviously, we're having a kind of casual conversation and you're not trying to write like an essay or like an op-ed. So there's a way in which you're right. And then, of course, there's a way in which that doesn't fully capture it. The way the economy functions doesn't support a return to a manufacturing-based high-wage economy where people do one job their whole lives and they have a wage and union sort of regime around that life that allows them to progressively make more money until they have a retirement at a high standard of living. It's usually the conservative thing that they imagine the 1950s as some idyllic paradise. Because wages were high, blue-collar working class people could get homes and were homeowners. And the 1950s was obviously terrible in a lot of ways. It's weird when leftists sort of fantasize about that. But there are other elements of the New Deal that weren't obsolete, and they didn't go away because developments in technology and the base of the economy sort of slouched them off. Obviously, as we've gone into a post-Fordist society, the competing factions of elite that vie to make decisions over the economy have not been concerned with replacing the mechanisms that allowed for the increase in standards of living for the average American worker as the economies become financialized and globalized. And empirically, we have seen standards of living for all racial demographics of workers declining since the late 1970s. So basic human happiness index things, wage levels, relative buying power has climbed. The trend has been down for like 50 fucking years. Which, by the way, really matters in this story about fascism. And it is true that we haven't figured out a way to replace that. And it's not a matter of just rolling back the clock. But there's other elements of the New Deal that were politically targeted and intentionally removed. And that is the redistributive regime that allowed for robust social services, particularly welfare, housing, and higher education. So under the New Deal, part of the tax revenue was used to either make college a lot more affordable or make it entirely free, as it was in all of California's higher education systems for decades. So we have gutted the welfare state, which sort of in the early and middle 20th century became one of the premises of a state. If a state can impose laws, if a state can send you to a cataclysmic world war, maybe even twice, if a state can make all these requirements, it also has to provide services. And most of the industrialized world and much of the third world provides more robust social services than the United States, particularly after the collapse of the New Deal. And considering the relative difference in wealth, that should be really shameful. There's a lot of complicated history there. The New Deal was kind of a masterclass as a centrist policy, actually. If you define centrism classically in a sort of Aristotelian sense, a kind of Aristotelian concept of centrism is not the shallow relativistic thing where it's one guy says one thing, another guy says another thing, and they're both kind of right. I'm in the middle. Because obviously that type of centrism is just sort of defined by how far anyone's speaking is, and it also implies that issues have binaries, when in fact issues are often three-dimensional. There are multiple perspectives. There are moral perspectives. There are more than two moral perspectives. There are functional and practical perspectives. There's economic perspectives. There's historical perspectives. You have a three-dimensional ball. The classical sort of understanding of centrism is something that balances pros and cons that can be empirically demonstrated from a list of alternatives. So if there's something in conservative politics that's important, that seems useful as a tool, if there's something in communist politics that's important and useful in a tool, you try and take the tools and congeal them into a single thing. In the practice of politics, it's about recognizing that different interests exist. From the Aristotelian perspective, you can never get rid of competing interests. The point of politics is to produce the maximum amount of stability and harmony, and what centrism means is coming up with compromises that balance those interests as much as possible. So the instantiation of the New Deal provided a lot politically for the right. It provided a lot politically for the left, but it actually achieved something that was more fundamental in the 1930s, which was the US political economy was completely destabilized. Destabilized in a way in which the average worker was struggling to survive, and businesses were struggling to survive because of an unstable labor regime, right? And so the core question of instability from an Aristotelian perspective was this question of an unstable and chaotic labor regime and labor relationship between employers and employees. And so there's a way in which, even though employers give up a level of, thank you, I'll need to get my water in a second. Employers give up a level of power and authority in the 30s and 40s to the New Deal. They receive immediate benefits. And unions, through the contract regime, end up passively doing a lot of the management and stabilizing of the workforce. It becomes easier to manage workers. It becomes easier for the state to kind of understand and manipulate flow of workers in and out of geographies and in and out of different sectors of industry. Even in labor relations and human resource literature, from this time, the initial instantiation of the New Deal is referred to by both labor historians and within pro-corporate human resources literature as, quote, the labor peace. Okay, let me get the water so I can help you redeem that hydrate. I also like that you said that's a great definition of politics. I was more trying to define Aristotelian centrism, but Aristotle didn't think of that as centrism. Aristotle thought of that as politics. I don't think that's the only way to think about politics is, so I clarify that that's Aristotelian centrism. Okay, so today's decision to grant former presidents criminal immunity reshapes the institution of the presidency. It makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law. This is not like a hot take or a leftist read. That is literally what the ruling is saying it's trying to do. It is specifically trying to make the president above the law to such an extreme extent that the court doesn't want the president to ever even worry about whether what they're doing is illegal. The president should not only be technically or juridically immune from prosecution, but the president should be psychologically free from even having to worry about consequences. It is worried about a presidential psychology under which a president would even hesitate because of a concern of illegality. And it fucking uses the word hesitation. Relying on little more than its own misguided wisdom about the need for bold and unhesitating action, which again, this is a pretty good call out. Nothing says that the point of the president is to be a position that is first and foremost defined by the freedom to take bold and unhesitating action. This is the interjection of a new and alien understanding of the presidency by these 6 justices. Because our Constitution does not shield a former president from answering for criminal and treasonous acts, I dissent. Oh, and I just realized I need to do this hydrate. 1, 2. The indictment paints a stark portrait of a president desperate to stay in power. In the weeks leading up to January 6, 2021, then President Trump allegedly spread lies that there have been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won, despite being notified repeatedly by his closest advisors that his claims were untrue. And if there's any Trump supporters here, go and look into this, because in fact, his own advisors did constantly tell him that there was no fraud or not sufficient fraud to change the outcome of the election. This is well known. The vast majority of his staff and expert counsel told him this. That happened. These were Trump loyalists in the Trump administration. You were fucking lied to. When dozens of courts swiftly rejected these claims, Trump allegedly pushed officials in certain states to ignore the popular vote, disenfranchise millions of voters, dismiss legitimate electors, and ultimately cause the ascertainment of and voting by illegitimate electors. I want to be clear that these are also not allegations. These things are established in fact. Trump did these things. He did and is on tape instructing other public officials to ignore the popular vote. The point is to disenfranchise millions of voters. He tried to dismiss legitimate electors, and he tried to sneak fake electors into the Electoral College, pretending to be the real ones to cast different ballots. All of these things happened. All of them have been traced to Trump as a matter of fact. The only thing that is alleged or unclear is whether or not Trump is allowed to do that. And the point of the ruling, in the most immediate political sense, is to say that, in fact, a president who has lost an election does indeed have the power to push officials to ignore votes, does have the power to disenfranchise millions of voters, does have the power to dismiss legitimate electors, and does have the power to insert his own electors. And let's be really clear. The Supreme Court is hearing this case precisely because Trump is making the argument that he should be allowed to do these things. He is not making the argument that I did not do these things. He took this to the Supreme Court to make the argument that as an outgoing president, I am allowed to do these things. I can disenfranchise millions of voters. I can get rid of real Electoral College electors. And I can push public officials to throw out votes. And do you know what the Supreme Court said? They said, absolutely, that is within your authority to do. Trump is not here to say, I didn't do them. Trump is here to say, I am allowed to do them. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you are, sir. And by the way, any other president is allowed to do it too. If they don't like the outcome of an election, they can do these things. It is alleged that he went so far as to threaten one state election official with criminal prosecution if the official did not find 11,780 votes Trump needed. This is on tape. You can hear Trump doing this. When state officials repeatedly declined to act outside their legal authority and alter their state election process, Trump and his co-conspirators purportedly developed a plan to disrupt and displace the legitimate election certification process by organizing fraudulent slates of electors. As the date of the certification process neared, Trump allegedly also sought to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to bolster his knowingly false claims of election fraud by initiating sham election crime investigations and spending official letters falsely claiming the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the election outcome, while falsely presenting the fraudulent electors as valid alternatives to the legitimate electors. This is also something Trump did that is beyond dispute. It is a matter of fact. Trump tried to instruct the Justice Department to announce that they had found massive fraud. And when the Justice Department said that they couldn't find fraud, Trump instructed them to announce it anyways because it would help bolster his efforts to hold on to his claim to the presidency, because it would shift public opinion in his favor. So he wanted to take the Justice Department and have it just lie because people would trust the Justice Department, and that would benefit him. He wanted to take federal bureaucracies and turn them into propaganda mouthpieces for his own self-interest for the purpose of manipulating the American population. And one of the reasons why this case is even before the court isn't because Trump is saying, I didn't do that. It's because Trump is saying, I should be allowed to do that. And the court has said, yes, sir, you are allowed to do that. We agree. When the department refused to do as he asked, Trump turned to the vice president. Initially, he sought to persuade the vice president to use a ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election results. When persuasion failed, he purportedly attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C. to pressure the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results. Speaking of that crowd on January 6th, Trump falsely claimed that based on fraud, the vice president could alter the outcomes of election results. When this crowd then violently attacked the Capitol and halted proceedings, Trump allegedly delayed in taking any steps to rein in the chaos he had unleashed. Do you know who made that allegation? One of the many people, Ivanka Trump, his daughter, who testified that she essentially begged her father to call off the riots, to do something about it, to just tell them to go home. And her father's response was to walk into the other room, walk into one of the White House dining rooms, and just watch the television coverage for 3 hours and do nothing. So the allegation for this comes from his own family. That is the backdrop against which this case comes to court. The court now confronts a question it has never had to answer in the nation's history: whether a former president enjoys immunity from federal criminal prosecution. The majority thinks he should, and so it invents an atextual, ahistorical, and unjustifiable immunity that puts the president above the law. The majority makes 3 moves that in effect completely insulate presidents from criminal liability. First, the majority creates absolute immunity for the president's exercise of core constitutional powers. This holding is unnecessary on the facts of the indictment, and the majority's attempt to apply it to the facts expands the concept of core powers beyond any recognizable bounds. Yes, because it now includes that a president might even psychologically in his mind entertain the thought that he might have to hesitate and exercise restraint, and if the president were to do that, then the president is being improperly violated by the threat of prosecution, and therefore requires the safety and comfort of understanding they have total immunity from everything. In any event, it is quickly eclipsed by the second move, which is to create an expansive immunity for all official acts. Whether described as presumptive or absolute, under the majority's rule, a president's use of any official power for any purpose, even the most corrupt, is immune from prosecution. That is just as bad as it sounds, and it is baseless. Finally, the majority declares that evidence concerning acts for which the president is immune can play no role in any criminal prosecution against him. Do you remember we read that? The courts cannot make determinations about allegations about whether an act is official or unofficial. You cannot bring evidence because a court, according to this ruling, doesn't have the authority to find facts and make rulings on these questions. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. For a couple decades, there's been this swelling, growing fascist movement that is now at a point where it's well organized enough to win the presidency and also has a worked out and developed fascist platform that it wants to implement. If you don't know what that is, go look up Project 2025. Argument by argument, the majority invents immunity. Brute force. Under scrutiny, its arguments crumble. To start, the majority's broad official acts immunity is consistent with text, history, and established understanding of the president's role. Moreover, it is deeply wrong, even on its own functionalist terms. Next, the majority's core immunity is both unnecessary and misguided. Furthermore, the majority's illogical evidentiary holding is unprecedented. Finally, this majority's project will have disastrous consequences for the presidency and our democracy. I've already seen people like on Twitter trying to work out like what this means, and they are dramatically underestimating how disastrous this is because they're thinking about it in a very mechanical way about what specific types of acts can the president do and what kind of legal consequences can there be and what if you impeach, and they're not thinking about the lived, experienced, material, relational reality of living in a situation where someone has absolute authority. They're not thinking about the soft power question. There is no holding people accountable when they have absolute authority to do anything they want to you. And one of the reasons for that is that it's hard for you to even think the thoughts because you already understand you're in a system where they will win at the stroke of a pen or the opening of their mouths. There won't be impeachments. Okay, so you can't be criminally prosecuted, but can the president be impeached? Wouldn't you still have that power there? Because of this, the president has the power to like imprison his political opponents. And if you were in Congress, you would understand that before you ever thought about impeachment. And it would affect the way you think about impeachment. And the primary way it would affect the way you thought about impeachment is you really wouldn't think about it. Because it would be like thinking about jumping off a cliff. There are soft power questions here that are very dangerous. The president doesn't have to impose when people already understand that there are consequences. The main takeaway of today's decision is that all of a president's official acts defined without regard to motive or intent are entitled to immunity that is at least presumptive and quite possibly absolute. Whenever the president wields the enormous power of his office, the majority says the criminal law cannot touch him. This official acts immunity has no firm grounding in constitutional text, history, or precedent. Indeed, those standard grounds for constitutional decision-making all point in the opposite direction. No matter how you look at it, the majority's official acts immunity is utterly indefensible. A majority calls for a careful assessment of the scope of presidential power under the Constitution. For the majority, that careful assessment does not involve the Constitution's text. I would start there. The Constitution's text contains no provision for immunity from criminal prosecution for the presidents. Of course, the silence of the Constitution on this score is not dispositive, insofar as the majority rails against the notion that a specific textual basis is required. It is attacking an argument that has not been made here. The omission in the text of the Constitution is worth noting, however, for at least three reasons. First, the framers clearly knew how to provide for immunity from prosecutions. They did provide for narrow immunity for legislators in the speech or debate clause. They did not extend the same or similar immunity to presidents. Second, some state constitutions at the time of the framing specifically provided express criminal immunities to sitting governors. The framers chose not to include similar language in the Constitution to immunize the president. If the framers had wanted to create some constitutional privilege to shield the president from criminal indictment, they could have done so. Third, insofar as the Constitution does speak to this question, it actually contemplates some form of criminal liability for former presidents. The majority correctly rejects Trump's argument that a former president cannot be prosecuted unless he has been impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate for the same conduct. The majority ignores, however, that the impeachment judgment clause cuts against its own position. That clause presumes the availability of criminal process as a backstop by establishing that an official impeached and convicted by the state shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. That clause clearly contemplates that a former president may be subject to criminal prosecution for the same conduct that resulted in impeachment judgment, including conduct such as bribery, which implicates official acts almost by definition. Aware of its lack of textual support, the majority points out that this court has recognized presidential immunities and privileges rooted in the constitutional tradition of the separation of powers and supported by our history. That is true as far as it goes. Nothing in our history, however, supports the majority's entirely novel immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. The historical evidence that exists on presidential immunity from criminal prosecution cuts decisively against it. For example, Alexander Hamilton wrote that former presidents would be liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law. This is really critical because the majority attempted to use Hamilton very specifically. They attempted to use some of the language in Federalist 70 to establish immunity. But in Federalist 69, Hamilton directly talks about the lack of immunity. Hamilton's significance in these legal questions is that Hamilton provided the arguments that most directly influenced the logic of the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. For Hamilton, that was an important distinction between the King of Great Britain, who was sacred and inviolable, and the President of the United States, who would be amenable to personal punishment and disgrace. You could almost say that from a system design perspective, the fundamental premise of the revolutionary project at its most basic level was to establish rule of law in opposition to an autocratic monarchy. Now, that's not a political economic perspective. That's not what drove the revolution. I understand. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a naive liberal about why the revolution was carried out. But the point of the legal structure of the United States is very clearly, at the time of the post-revolution, to establish a sharp distinction from autocratic monarchy. If I need to prove my left credential here, let me just say the reason why they needed to do that was because the United States was controlled by a bourgeois class that was not unified. It was fractured across two different political economies that were then sub-fractured. And the reason they needed to establish rule of law was in order to cooperate to establish a bourgeois state, they needed to agree to a system where their competitors, should they win office, couldn't just then completely dictate terms to them. They needed to think of rules for their competition where they could imagine allowing one of their competitors to have more power than them. Thus, rule of law and equality under the law. In contrast to the king, the president should be subject to personal responsibility for his actions. Yeah, so we just read that. At the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, who was aware that some state constitutions provided governors immunity, proposed that the convention consider what privileges ought to be allowed to the executive. There is no record of any such discussion. Delegate Charles Pinckney later explained that the convention which formed the Constitution well knew that no subject had been more abused than privilege, and so it determined to limit privilege to what was necessary and no more. No privilege was intended for the executive. I don't think I do want to read all of this because we're getting a history lesson on the obvious. The legal theory of the United States, as fucked up as the United States is, as a hegemonic white supremacist heteropatriarchal empire, this ruling is not within the realm of credible interpretations of the development of this legal system from any perspective whatsoever. It's doing very specific type of work. It's foregrounding a shift into an autocratic executive that can be better utilized by a fascist with the backing of a fascist movement. And there just happens to be one running for office right now. This is designed to not only shield him from past prosecution, but to give him total immunity for what he might do going forward. And what's he going to do going forward? Well, he released a pretty substantive list, and most of the items on that list are things that are not legal for the president to do. Project 2025, based on this ruling, I guess it's just a coincidence that now he can do all of those things if he wants to. Setting aside this evidence, the majority announces that former presidents are absolutely, or at least presumptively, immune from criminal prosecution for other official acts. The majority purports to keep us in suspense as to whether this immunity is absolute or presumptive, but it quickly gives up the game. It explains that at a minimum, the president must be immune from prosecution for an official act unless the government can show that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose no dangers of intrusions on the authority and functions of the executives. No dangers, none at all. It is hard to imagine a criminal prosecution for a president's official acts that would pose no dangers of intrusions on presidential authority in the majority's eyes. This is what we were saying earlier. In the president's own mind, they're not supposed to be intruded upon by the thought that there may be a consequence for anything they do. And the moment they've had that intrusion, oh no, am I allowed to do this? The system has actually failed the president, because the president should have total confidence in anything he may or may not want to do. Essentially absolute authority. Nor should that be the standard. Surely some intrusions on the executive may be justified by an overriding need to promote objectives within the constitutional authority of Congress. Other intrusions may be justified by the primary constitutional duty of the judicial branch to do justice in criminal prosecutions. According to the majority, however, any incursion on an executive power is too much. When presumptive immunity is this conclusive, the majority's indecision as to whether immunity must be absolute or whether instead presumptive immunity is sufficient hardly matters. I feel like we've covered it. I know there's a lot more there to read, and I'm sure there's some juicy tidbits, but it's actually a pretty long document. We find, I think, the core passages that allow us to understand how this works. And there's some very dangerous elements to this. This is absolute authority for the president. The president is so free to act that if the president has to even worry in their own mind for 1 second and have one hesitation about a potential consequence to them of any action they take, it is actually the president who has been intruded on. The system is not allowed to question the motives of any act the president makes. And courts are not allowed to make rulings to distinguish whether an act is official or unofficial, though the president is only immune on the official acts. Courts can't, however, make a distinction between the two. So, all acts in function are official acts. Now, it is true that we don't live in a magical checks and balance utopia that we're told about in grade school. And it is true that to the extent the American legal system sometimes seems functional, it's grounded in a differential application that often is so extreme that it amounts to different citizenship or quasi-citizenship systems, where, for example, white people have a system that often operates as relatively fair, and people of color have a different system. All of these things are true. The United States is a political economy where policies do certain types of work, achieve certain types of goals, and pursue certain types of interests. The United States is a hegemonic, heteropatriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist system, full stop. But there are things that I think people of all sort of ideologies, but particularly many leftists who, not a jab or a dig at them, because it's one of the beauties of the internet, but whose leftism is primarily grounded in kind of, without sort of judgment, but say maybe compared to like search texts, superficial, useful but incomplete presentations of what power is and how it works. And one of the things that is misunderstood is that because there is a capitalist class, that the US power system is monolithic. I think the influence of bad readings of Karl Marx encourages this, though Marx would never portray power under capitalism as monolithic either, and never did. The way that power works is that, let's just use the term elite. You could use bourgeois, doesn't really matter for our purposes right now. It's a simplification we can allow. There are people with power and people with relatively less power. That can appear as though it's a monolithic binary. There's a monolithic group and a subordinate group below them. But what is really happening is within that elite group, they are competing with each other. There's a high degree of elite competition. They don't all have the same interests, and unfortunately, most of the time, workers or those without power are not actually a functional threat to them. At moments where they are, that competition sort of congeals into higher levels of cooperation to kind of restore subordination. But mostly, those elites engage we at the lower strata to assist them in their competitions with each other. Whether that's sectors of industry, whether that's businesses within a sector of industry, whether that's political parties, whether that's corporate brands, media, conglomerates, whatever. We're part of their competitions. We're exploited as workers and renters, and then we're also pawns and resources in their intra-group competition. This is not a good situation to be in. This is a power system that's more hegemonic, and hegemonies are insidious and slippery and dangerous. But they're not as bad, particularly from the perspective of resistance, as fascistic autocracies. And the reason is, in context where elites exist in competition and require the participation of we plebeians, the proletarians, the small folk out here, you and I, in a context where our participation is required for them to win their things, it's possible to create leverage here and there that improves material conditions. And this is really critical for imagining successful liberatory and left-wing projects. There is this assumption that the worse things get, the angrier people get, and the more left-wing they are. But history does not bear that out. Things have to get better and then start to get worse really quickly, and then you get a left-wing revolution. After the 7 Years' War in the United States, conditions for the colonists were getting better. And then they got taxed. Quick drop. I know everyone's perception of the Soviet Revolution is that things got really bad and people were finally fed up. But in fact, Russia was liberalizing right before World War I. And then that popped them down. The French Revolution, the same thing. Things have been liberalizing. And then Louis XVI fucked it up. Human beings have bodies. We require calories. We need energy. We imagine our lives based on the experience of our lives. If you look at material data, things that like Marxists in particular want the left to look at, political economic data, the reason why, if you really look at the information from these periods where more left revolutions happen, the reason why conditions go up first and that matters is because people have a lived experience of expecting and believing and being in a world where life gets better over time, and they're authorized to expect that it will do so, such that when it gets worse, they feel that it's a violation. And that allows for people to feel a sense of solidarity with those other people who are outraged. And the point of that solidarity is to restore the improvement of conditions. It allows for bonds of solidarity that, unlike right-wing movements, are more grounded in improvement, empathy, expansion, etc. When you have conditions in which quality of life is declining, people are getting more stressed out, they're getting more anxious, they feel more insecure, life feels more precarious, they expect that things will get worse and worse within a context of life feeling basically insecure. They expect that will intensify. It's not possible to imagine your life getting better because you don't have an experience of that. You don't really have a real sense of what that is, except for maybe it's like, I'd have a lot more money. The sense of outrage you feel is not that you've been robbed, it's that somebody else has something. And that lends itself in particular to the racialization of resentment and outrage, because the need to deposit your resentment on an other requires an other. And people can find those others. They don't even have to be told. But they are, and those things are manipulated by authoritarian and fascist movements. So when material conditions decline, people become more, I wouldn't even say susceptible, they become more authoritarian at the level of their subjectivity. They legitimately, as human beings, want it, feel more comfortable in it, because even if an authoritarian regime is cruel and incompetent and even isn't particularly promising you anything, in relation to a sense of uncertainty and increasing alienation and increasing precariousness, an authoritarian regime at least creates a clear sense of rules and consequences. It allows you, at the very least, to feel a sense of stability and knowability about the future. This basic dynamic is what Hobbes grounds his entire authoritarian politics on. Well, if you're interested in that psychology of it, like, there's a lot of different things. There's Marxist work on it. There's anarchist work on it. You can read people like Eric Fromm. But I suggest that you start just with Hobbes' Leviathan if you're interested in the dynamics around authority and fear and uncertainty. So, put it all together. In a hegemonic system like ours with competing elite, one of the things that is more possible is in the competitions for social movements as they're building, growing, learning, before they're possible, it's possible for them to have a revolutionary takeover or impose big change. As they're growing, one of the things that it becomes possible to do is it becomes possible for them to leverage the fact that elites are dependent on them to make profits, to win their competitions with each other in order to get concessions. Those concessions do two things. One, they improve the living conditions, the material conditions for those who receive the concessions. And two, they also validate elective action. So people have the lived experience of A, that it works, and B, how do you do it? In an actual monolithic authoritarian system, there's no advantage to elites. You can simply suppress them. You can just kill their leaders. Authoritarians and fascists understand the material conditions game. This is actually really worked out in political theory 2,000 years ago. It's part of basic statecraft. This thing of conditions go up, people will be sort of like more bold. Conditions go down, people are more scared, more prone to authoritarianism. This is worked out in ancient texts, and it's just reinforced up until you get in the 20th century. Fascists understand it too. And when they're given the authority to simply put their boot down, kill movement leaders, economically blacklist participants that go to the strikes or protests or whatever, you're not going to get those things off the ground. And since elites are not going to improve material conditions on their own in either type of system, and one type of system at least gives people the opportunity to improve their own material conditions by engaging in more complex forms of competition. And because you need to raise material conditions to build revolutionary capacity, and just basic anti-fascist and anti-authoritarian consciousness, because people aren't as fucking scared and insecure and worried about how they're going to feed themselves. One of the things that happens as you go into authoritarianism and conditions decline is, in fact, you do not get closer and more accelerated to revolution. You go deeper into the belly of the beast. And that's something that we need to really understand. For liberals and also leftists who are thinking too mechanically about this ruling, in terms of Section A here says you could possibly prosecute a president if the official act's motive has been... You're missing the point. This is not a legal ruling. This is a political ruling. Read the dissenting opinion and also use your own head. Read those first few paragraphs. Everything that comes after the language that says the president cannot be encumbered with even having to worry about whether something they do is illegal. Everything that comes after that point doesn't matter, because everything can be taken back to that test, and the president simply has to say, look, I wasn't trying to worry about what was illegal or not. I need to be totally immune so I can act boldly and without hesitation. And if the president can do whatever he wants, there's not going to be real resistance to the president. At the most micro level of how people file their taxes, more and more people will be trying to act in a way that doesn't make the president angry at them. The panoptic logics, the logics at which people sort of worry that they might be perceived or surveilled, they will get stronger without the president having to do anything, as long as they understand the president can do anything. And at the macro level, every bureaucrat, every corporate entity that wants something, every other politician will have a huge amount of incentives to do exactly what the president wants to do all the time, and very, very little incentive to make the president unhappy. Because in this context, the president would actually be authorized to kill you. Maybe they just repossess your home. Maybe they just take your bank account. Maybe they just the FBI announced that you're some kind of deranged sex pervert of some other kind. Because remember that one of the things Donald Trump's lawyer explicitly argued the president should be immune from and allowed to do is the president should be able to direct agencies to make false allegations about other people in the United States for the purposes of harming them and benefiting the president. The president's lawyer argued before the Supreme Court that the president has the power to do that, and the Supreme Court agreed. So don't get too lost in the weeds. This is a political intervention. It is not a legal intervention. The point of this ruling is to reconfigure how power works along autocratic lines. It is to establish absolute authority of the president. It is a return to a system that has one person who is the final arbiter of any matter they choose to intervene and is above the law. And some of the specific activities that are taken up in this court case are what happens if that president wants to do things like threaten vote counters, throw out votes, generally try and end an election. Can the president try and end an election? Because Donald Trump was arguing, yes, I can try and end elections if I'm the president. He said, all those things I'm accused of doing, I'm allowed to do them. And the court said, yeah. Which means that these people don't have to leave if they don't want to. You have the one president, and that president can do whatever they want, including using their power to stay in office even if the people vote for someone else. Presumably, they have the power to cancel the election entirely. So the next president you elect might just be someone that's president for as long as they choose to be or until they die. Okay. With all that being said, I think I'm going to call it and say goodnight to you all. It's been wonderful hanging out, though our topic has been depressing. Hopefully we'll play some video games or something this week. I hope somehow there's some kind of better news coming up. All power to the people. Free Palestine. See you guys soon.